Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode by Nowhere You Derres. Today we'll be going through endocrine system, right? We'll be uncovering biology's own hormones, and we're going to be speaking about hypothalamus and a lot of hormones and um, what are the categories, etc., etc. So stick around, make sure to like and comment down below what topic should I uncover next. And if you have any comments at all, please leave them. Thank you. So let's start. What are hormones? Hormones basically can be steroids, peptides, or amino acid derivatives. Alright, so there are three types that a hormone can be. So let's start with a peptide hormone. Peptide hormone is basically made up of amino acid derivatives from polypeptides, and then they bind to extracellular receptors. In order to recognize them, they usually end in INE or IN. So what is a peptide hormone? So it's a first messenger that binds to a receptor and triggers the transmission of second messenger signal. So basically it's like a starter. So you know how you put your key in a car to start? This is basically it. So a hormone is a messenger that binds to a receptor and then triggers that transmission of second signal. So we got an example here. So we got a hormone that is a peptide hormone, binds to a receptor. When it binds to this receptor, it activates the secondary messenger signaling cascade, such as, for instance, CAMP. You know, lowers or raises CAMP levels. So basically, a second messenger, in order to be activated, it's waiting on a hormone to bind to a receptor, and this receptor triggering it and activating the second messenger. So then we got steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are nonpolar and they're made up of cholesterol. They're produced by gonads and adrenal cortex, right? So them being nonpolar means they can cross membranes easily. They have intracellular cytosol or intracellular receptors. So they either have like receptors on the inside or the outside. And they usually end in ONE, ol or oid. That's how you can recognize the difference between the both of them. Here ine, ein, and here on, ol, or oid. So with steroids, they bind to receptors, for instance, and then this receptor triggers the DNA, resulting in transcription changes in some genes. So steroids are involved in transcription changes. Um, Usually, this is how most hormones are. They're like do you remember the key in the car example? Yeah, they bind to receptors and then they activate other messengers or other processes. So steroid hormones are not water soluble and they need to be carried by proteins. They just can't go around like wandering around. They need to be carried by proteins. Steroids undergoes conformational changes such as dimerization, pairing two receptor hormones complex. So they change their conformation in order to either bind or go through a membrane, etc., etc. So now, what's the difference between steroid hormone and a peptide hormone? So insulin, for instance, is a peptide hormone, right? It means it's fast, but it's short-lived. And then an example of a steroid hormone is estrogen or testosterone, right? They are slow, but they're long-lived. So peptide hormone is fast but short-lived. Estrogen, testosterone, which are steroids, are slow but long-lived. And lastly, we have amino acid derivative hormones such as epinephrine, norepinephrine, or thyroxine derived from one or two amino acids, and they end in INE or IN. So you see the similarity between amino acid derivative hormones and peptide hormones. Uh, they're pretty much a little bit similar. So with the amino acid derivative hormones, you have epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're short-lived. They bind to G protein receptors. So with peptide hormone and amino acid derivative hormones, they both have a lot of amino acids from polypeptides. They're both short-lived and they end in INE or IN. Thyroid hormones bind intracellular and are slow, but they're long-lasting, such as T3 and T4. Amino acid derivative hormones also have um, the slow but long-lasting hormones, such as steroids. So it's kind of, you can say, a mix of both of them. So we're going to be going through T3 and T4 later, thyroid hormones. So we're going to be speaking about hypothalamus, arguably one of the most important aspects or one of the most important parts of the endocrine system, because it contains a nuclei and its lateral and ventromedial and anterior, and it plays a role in the emotional experience and aggressive behavior. So um, you see, if someone has a lot of emotional experiences or emotions, or they display like a lot of aggressive behavior, it's mainly due to hypothalamus sending and controlling the behavior or the experiences. Hypothalamus also regulates the pituitary gland through tropical hormones and controls the glands by releasing hormones into portal system between them. So we're going to be also speaking about what is negative feedback, right? And it is basically responsible for hormone release in hypothalamus, where a hormone can inhibit other hormones to conserve energy. We'll be speaking about that very shortly. So now we're going to discuss how the hypothalamus really acts on and kind of controls the pituitary gland or regulates it. So the hypothalamus releases hormones, the tropical hormones we're speaking about, into the hypophyseal portal system, which are basically blood vessels, series of blood vessels, you see, as you see here. And then they travel and bind to the anterior pituitary gland. Here I made a table, you know, showcasing the four main tropical hormones and what they turn into once they reach the pituitary gland. So you got the GnRH, so the gonadotropin releasing hormone. It turns into two things: luteinizing hormone LH and follicle stimulate hormone FSH. So GnRH turns into LH plus FSH. And then you got growth releasing hormone GHRH. So I want you to also notice something when we're going through this, because we're going to be speaking about it later. So it goes and becomes a growth hormone in the pituitary gland. And thyroid releasing hormone, it turns into a thyroid stimulating hormone when it reaches the pituitary gland. And you got corticotropin releasing hormone, it turns into adrenocorticotropic hormone. So the thing I wanted to speak about was that in the hypothalamus, in order to recognize the hormones, they're called releasing hormones. So they're being released, and then here they're not, you can't really find the word releasing. You're just gonna find the word hormone, and it's more short formed on here, except for the thyroid is thyroid stimulating hormone. So this is how you know the difference between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So we have this a picture describing what I was talking about, how it travels and goes through the hypophyseal portal system into the pituitary gland to transfer into direct hormones. So anterior gland also has a direct hormone such as prolactin, GH, growth hormone, and endorphins. So prolactin is important for milk stimulation in mammary glands. So prolactin is really important in the milk stimulation in females, and endorphins they decrease the perception of pain. So due to these hormones, the pain is actually less than what is supposed to be. And the growth hormone, it promotes muscle and bone growth, but it requires glucose and the breakdown of fatty acids. So we said we're going to be speaking about the negative feedback. Alright, so on the right, we'll take an example. Let's say the cortisol levels are too high, or the glucocorticoids levels are too high. You know, they're being produced too much of them. So what happens in a negative feedback is that it inhibits the hypothalamus, and it triggers or sends a signal to inhibit the hypothalamus, which as you can see here, the whole cycle starts at the hypothalamus, and then it triggers and activates pituitary gland and activates the adrenal cortex, which produces this. So in the negative feedback, they basically just block the main source where the hormone, or where the production starts, and then it also blocks the pituitary gland from releasing both CRF and ACTH. CRH and CRF are basically the same thing. It's just hormone versus something else. And it also blocks the pituitary gland from releasing ACTH, the androcorticotropin hormone. So this means that there will be no more production of cortisols. Means that once the negative feedback is activated, the production stops until it's needed again. Alright, so you also got posterior pituitary, so you got posterior and anterior. So with the posterior pituitary, the hypothalamus sends axons to release oxytocin and antidiuretic hormones. So oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions during labor and milk during lactation, and it uses a positive feedback. So oxytocin is important during labor and during milk. So we got two things that are important during milk. So we got oxytocin and prolactin. They're both important for milk stimulation. Then you got the ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. With ADH, increases the reabsorption of water and collecting dust of the kidneys. As ADH increases, so does plasma osmolarity. Right now we're in Ramadan, so I think we really need a lot of ADH in order to increase the reabsorption of water, so we can survive the whole day. ADH is released in response to low blood volume and to increase the plasma molarity, and then increases the water reabsorption, which increases the water retention and increases the blood volume and the blood pressure. So right now, let's say you're fasting, you have low blood volume and low plasma osmolarity. ADH is going to be released in order to increase your water reabsorption, water retention. Then lastly, we got the thyroid. The thyroid is another important organ in the endocrine system, and thyroid is controlled by the thyroid stimulating hormone TSH from the anterior pituitary. So the thyroid promotes calcium homeostasis and sets basal metabolic rates by releasing T3, T4, and calcium homeostasis through calcitonin. Remember, the T3 and T4, they're amino acid derivative hormones. So, like we said, they're amino acid derivative hormones, and the difference between T3 and T4 is basically due to iodine atoms. T3 and T4 are produced in the follicular cells of the thyroid. They alter the utilization of glucose and fatty acids and reset the basic metabolic rates by making energy production more or less efficient. So when T3 and T4 increase, it increases the cellular respiration, which then increases protein and fatty acid turnover controlled by negative feedback. So T3 and T4, they're responsible for the utilization of glucose and fatty acid and reset basal metabolic rates by making energy efficient. Alright, that's it for the endocrine system for the MCAT. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please let me know if you have any questions or anything you need to speak about. Thank you.